Good afternoon, Facebook friends, and happy Tuesday. I want to talk about a subject today that might be a little controversial, especially to our millennials and some of our African American males. If I had to give the subject a title, it would probably be, "We Are No Longer Slaves." Now, I was talking to some of my former students recently, and they were saying things like, well, Sister Swain, we appreciate everything you did for us, but the Bible was written by some white men and it was used to oppress the slaves. So, we ain't down with that no more. So I decided to read some of the books that they were reading and look at some of the movies that they were watching just to kind of get their perspective on things. And one of the movies that I saw was called I Am Not Your Negro. Now, this movie was narrated by James Baldwin, and he gave a very compelling comparison of the philosophies of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Medgar Evers, and Malcolm X. He also talked about the disillusionment of the African Americans where the American dream was concerned. And he talked about how he was so disillusioned himself that he left America altogether and spent much of his young life in Paris. Now, another movie that I saw, well, it's actually a documentary called 13th. And it was narrated by Angela Davis. Now, Angela Davis talked a lot about how it was for her back during the civil rights movement and how she was falsely accused of a crime that she didn't commit. And she was incarcerated, but she became her own attorney and got herself off. That was a wonderful documentary. And the last movie that I saw, and if you haven't seen it yet, it's called The Birth of a Nation. Absolutely wonderful. But you might want to pray ahead of time because it's very emotionally charged. And it's about a young boy who was the son of a slave, and his name was Nat Turner. Now, Nat Turner learned to read at a very young age, and when the master found out that he could read, they went out to the field and got him and took him to the big house. Now, while he was in the big house, the master's wife took him into the library, and he was looking around at all of the books, and it was like he was just salivating over the books and thinking about the places he could go and the things that he could see if he just had the opportunity to read these books. But the master's wife looked down at him and said, "Oh, no, Nat, those aren't your books. This is your book right over here." And she gave him the Bible. And at that point, she brainwashed him into believing that he was supposed to be a minister to minister only to the slaves, and that he was supposed to minister only those scriptures that would cause the slaves to be submissive. Well, that, of course, didn't sit well with Nat, and later on, of course, he caused a revolution that killed hundreds of African Americans as well as white people. So, or Caucasians, as we should say. That was a very, very good movie. Now, the book that I'm reading for the second time. One of the books is called The Warmth of Other Suns. Now, The Warmth of Other Suns chronologizes the lives of 3 African Americans, 2 male and 1 female. And it talks about how it was for them when they were growing up under the Jim Crow laws and trying to escape the Jim Crow laws of the South and move to the North. Well, actually, they went to the North, the East, as well as the West. But they were deceived, in a sense, or disillusioned, I'll say, because when they got to the places where they were going, they found that they didn't have total liberty. There was still a lot of oppression. And so the book tells about, the experiences that they encountered once they got there. But it was just an absolutely wonderful read. I would recommend that to everyone. Now, the last book that I read was called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. Now, this book was written by Dr. Joy DeGruy, and it's a very, very good read. I would recommend it to everyone, especially a lot of our millennials, because it talks about many of the atrocities that are occurring in our community still today at the hands of police officers and, other law enforcement agencies and what have you. And it talks about how, how it is when our young people go off to fight in the war and then they come back and they're never the same. And many of them have post-traumatic stress syndrome. Well, this is post-traumatic slave syndrome. And it talks about how a lot of the things that we're experiencing are really just fallouts from a slavery time. Well, after reading all of those books and looking at those movies, I had to get into the Word of God. And you know how it is when you're trying to really get an understanding of the Word and you use 2 or 3 different versions and you kind of oscillate back and forth between them? Well, I did that with the King James Version and the New International Version. And I took the New International Version of the Bible and I looked up the word slave. And it appeared continuously throughout the Old as well as the New Testament. And I looked up the same word slave in the King James Version, and it appeared twice, one in Jeremiah and once in Revelations. And in Jeremiah, it wasn't talking about an individual person, it was talking about a nation. So I was thinking, well, maybe the words are used interchangeably and they mean the same thing. So I decided to look them up in the dictionary. And of course, slavery means to, against one's will, work for no wages. And then the word servant means to work and to receive wages. So they're absolutely two different words. So as I looked further in the Bible, I'm not so naive as to believe that slaves didn't exist during biblical times, because they did. If you think about the two people, Sarah and Abraham. Sarah and Abraham had a handmaiden called Hagar. And when they thought they couldn't have children, Sarah gave Hagar to Abraham and said, maybe we can develop a family through her. Go ahead and take her as your wife and see if you can cause her to become pregnant. And of course, she did become pregnant, and she began to get angry with Sarah. And when Sarah saw that she was angry with her, she got angry back at Hagar and kind of lashed out at her. And Hagar went running down by the stream. And when she was down by the stream, an angel of the Lord appeared to her. Now let's also look at the story of Joseph. When Joseph was sold into slavery, God had gave him a gift. And that gift caused him, of course, through some other things that the Lord was working out in his life, to turn the entire situation around. Remember when Potiphar's wife accused him falsely of raping her and he was imprisoned? God used that special talent that he gave Joseph and turned that situation totally around. So I know that God was with the slaves, even as ridiculous as it may sound. And not only that, God never meant for slavery to be the way that it was. All of the degradation and all of the atrocities that were being committed as far as African Americans were concerned, the castrations and all of that, God never intended for that to happen. You see, in the Old Testament, they lived under the law. And in slavery during that time, they were breaking the law left and right. Sarah and Abraham committed adultery. Now, if God wanted that to occur, he would have taken the 10 commandments and one of the 10 would have sounded something like this. Instead of it saying, thou shalt not kill, it would have said, thou shalt not kill except if you're going to kill a slave. But it didn't say that. So God never meant for the Bible to be used to oppress any group of people. Now let's move on over to the New Testament. Now, Jesus Christ came to earth to die on the cross for the sins of the world. That means the sins of the slaves as well as the sins of the slave masters. He came to die on the cross for the sins of everyone, and he never intended for us to go back into that bondage. The Word of God says in Galatians 5:1, it says, stand therefore in the liberty wherewith Christ has set you free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. And then in Galatians chapter 4, verse 7, it says, so I call you no longer servants, but I call you sons. And if you are sons, then you are heirs. And I don't know about you, but I'm an heir of God through Jesus Christ. And as an heir, I want everything that the Lord has to offer. All of the love, joy, peace, long suffering, gentleness, goodness, meekness, faith, and temperance. I want it all. You see, God never intended for the book of the Bible, the Word of God, to be used in that manner. He sent the Word of God as a standard by which all men should live. It is a guide for us to live so that we could live harmoniously on this earth, free from sin. Now, a lot of times people want to say, well, what about Ephesians 6:3, where it says, servants, obey your masters in the flesh? Well, see, people like to take that out of context and use it and say, well, servants, we're servants and we're supposed to work in a certain way, not as men pleasers, but as unto Christ. Yeah, that is true. We are supposed to work in that manner. But people fail to go back up to Ephesians 6:1, where he starts and says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor thy father and thy mother, which is the first commandment with promise. And then he goes on and instructs the fathers, and he says, and fathers, do not provoke your children to anger. He says, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And then he says, Servants, obey your masters in the flesh, not as men pleasers, giving eye service, but as unto Christ. And then he goes and he says, and servants and masters, do the same with your servants. So he's giving instructions to everybody as to how to conduct ourselves on earth. So don't let anybody tell you that the Bible was used to coerce a certain group of people to act in a certain way. It was not. So what are we going to do? Are we just going to acrimoniously repudiate our white people? We can't do that. You know why? Because the caste system is still in existence. And it exists right here in the African American community. You see, until we stop committing black on black crime, until we stop acting like crabs in a barrel, and until we start supporting our black businesses with our finances, then we're going to need some white people. We can't sit around waiting to be indemnified by those who committed those atrocities against our ancestors. It's never going to happen. Brothers and sisters, give your life to Christ so that you can live an abundant life here on earth and live forever in glory when you leave this earth. God bless you, and I love you.